I see the goanna up a gum tree, he's going to get a feed today free when the campers leave the lake. Bits of chook and chocolate cake. It's Christmas time for him as well. See his big long belly swell. Oh, it's December in Australia. Chapter 33. Oh, it's December in Australia. Christmas in the Mallee for me was just a wonderful family get-together with cold chook and soft drinks. I can still hear the sounds of joy that rang out under the swamp box and river gums. I wonder if those huge mock orange trees are still there. Funny the things you remember. I've not seen that kind of tree since. Our mob weren't drinkers in that generation, but as kids we didn't know what that meant. So I suspect there might have been a few beers hidden in car boots so Grandma and Grandpa didn't see. The goanna verse in the song Christmas Photo is a recollection of those Mallee days in summer. My mother always had to get a family photo of these occasions. Such photos weren't really appreciated until years later. Later on, many of our Christmas family gatherings were in Gundawindi, where Mary Kay's parents lived. They had a huge backyard and a clay tennis court. The big yard was ideal for a game of cricket with all the kids, the nieces and nephews, of which there were many. So, being the camera enthusiast in the family, I took Mum's role in capturing that Christmas photo. When I came up with the idea for the Christmas Photo song, it was a combination of the nostalgia of Christmas in the Mallee and the big gatherings at Gundawindi. I thought all I have to do was get as many of the family as I could into the recording studio at Annandale in Sydney and actually take a photo. Unbeknown to them, we had the microphones open, so all the typical banter that went on at Christmas happened naturally. It was one of the best recording triumphs I've had. Every family nickname in the song is real. The whole family has nicknames that are used more than their real names. I'm proud of Christmas Photo. For me, the song is about celebrating a summer Christmas as we do in Australia, instead of singing jingle bells and songs about snow and sleighs. You might have noticed, I never tire of underlining what it is to be Australian. Aren't we lucky? The song Christmas Photo is how I came to meet Meg Doyle. As senior editor of the children's book publisher Scholastic Australia, she chose the song from my repertoire as an ideal Christmas picture book for kids in '98. The book was retitled Christmas in Australia. Shamefully, I wasn't all that excited about the project at the time. I thought it was a nice little money spinner, I suppose, but nothing compared to a hit album of songs. I was so disinterested or blasé, I don't even remember meeting Meg when I was invited to Scholastic to see the finished product. Who knows what was going on in my mind? I suspect her immediate boss took most of my attention, as he was a bit of a wanker. However, it was me, it seems, who Meg thought was the wanker. Ken Jolly, the managing director of Scholastic, invited me on the New South Wales Variety Bash to promote the book. Ken was not only a car enthusiast, but a great philanthropist and supporter of variety. The company had been involved in the bash for a number of years, taking a selected team of staff along for the ride in an old Thames school bus. My friend and philanthropist Dick Smith started the bash. He's an amazing ideas man. Back in 1985, he came up with this great way to extract dollars from car enthusiast mates who wouldn't normally venture onto outback bush tracks. He approached people like John Singleton, John Farnham and others who were both well known and well off. He charged them money to come along and called it a drive in the bush with your mates. They drove from Sydney to Bourke in far west New South Wales and then Burketown in the Gulf of Carpentaria. That first bash raised about $250,000 and the money was donated to Variety, the children's charity, known as the Variety Club at the time. That was the start of the New South Wales Variety Bash. The participants were fined for just about anything, even though they'd paid to go, and bribery became a part of the event. Since that first one, the Bash, as it has become affectionately known, has attracted people from all walks of life and raised in excess of $173 million for special needs children in Australia. Now there is a minimum entry fee per car, currently set at $8,500. Some people struggle to find this and rely on fundraising activities, from Lamington drives and sausage sizzles to golf days and harbour cruises. You name it, anything goes. These people are the real heart of what it means to be a basher nowadays. Having said that, there are generous millionaires, businessmen and philanthropists who wouldn't miss the bash each year, people like Dick Smith. That's the great beauty of the occasion. Everybody is equal on the dusty roads as the old cars travel over horrendous potholes and rocky terrain and through creeks and slippery mud. Phil Matthews thought it was a great idea for me to go on the bash. He and Scholastic came up with the idea for me to perform a concert for the children of Nyngan in central New South Wales and the surrounding district. It would be filmed for a video. This meant that I had to fly ahead of the cars to get set up for the concert in the early evening. Ken bribed Variety to be the first car out at the start, but then he and I transferred to a hire car and drove to the airport. That night was one of the most difficult performances I've ever been a part of. Kids are fine for a few songs, and I do have a number of family songs, but Phil had me doing an hour-and-a-half show. I was thoroughly out of my comfort zone, and I think a lot of the young audience was too. The kids were stuck for that time, sitting cross-legged on the floor of the hall, and the usual restlessness, fidgeting, and wanting to go to the bathroom was evident to me. I watched the video once and have since tipped several hundred of them into the council dump. What a shocker. I'll never agree to do a concert solely for kids again. Meg Doyle had been selected to go on the bash with Scholastic. She had to dress up as Miss Frizzle, the science teacher in the Magic School Bus series of books. She thought I was too full of myself to drive to Nyngan, not realising how complicated my day was. That first night in Nyngan, Meg was the only one who didn't make a fuss of me. Like a typical Scorpio, she sat in the background watching. While I was basically unaware of her, she was beginning to realise that maybe I wasn't just a wanker, but a wanker who had been put through the ringers that night. The next day, I was on the Magic School Bus, my first bash. It was amazing, bumping along the roughest dirt roads, past stations, towards Thargomindah, through the real sticks, the Gidgee, Mulga and Myall country. The first day on the bus, I did what typical Scorpios do and sat and observed. Who was I going to like enough to spark up a conversation with? There were only 8 of us on the bus and we had to spend a fair bit of time together. It wasn't long before I reasoned that the only one I could be bothered with was that dark-haired, intelligent, quiet one, Miss Frizzle. The bus stopped a number of times that day whenever we saw kids. I remember we stopped for 3 great little station kids waiting at their mailbox, watching the cars with their crazy character passengers going by. This was the kind of performance I could handle. I sang one song, Old Man Emu, and they couldn't believe it. By the end of the day, those kids would have experienced a show they couldn't buy and ended up with caps, lollies, show bags, footballs, teddy bears and badges from the passing cars. It was like Christmas for them. What a great idea this bash was. I was loving it. The next day, after one of our stops, I boldly plonked myself on the bench seat where Meg had been sitting, next to the window. I took out my writing pad and started to work on a song. Miss Frizzle climbed back on board the bus and was quite taken aback. "You're sitting in my seat," she said. "Well, you'll just have to sit next to me," I replied, which she did, much to my delight. I could tell by her persona that she was also a Scorpio. It's hard to explain, but there's an intensity in a Scorpio woman that has always been unmistakable to me. A fire, a quiet intelligence. In astrology, I've read that Scorpions observe things from a distance, then go under a rock to figure it all out before making a decision. Meg's way of observing me was typical Scorpio behaviour, I reckon. "You're a Scorpio, aren't you?" I said. She was born almost exactly 10 years after me in November. I could tell she was thinking, God, there's more to this wanker than I realised. She admitted she was born in November, and so our friendship started. I penned my song Thargomindah on the bus while I was sitting with her. She told me that she was impressed that I could write a song as we toured through the bush. I started to break down her hard scorpion shell. It's difficult for me not to go on about my love of the bush. I described most of the species of the trees out there and what the land was used for, and started to open the eyes of a girl brought up in Sydney's North Shore. By the end of that long day, we were chatting like old mates. I'm not trying to write a romantic novel here, but several days later, Meg told me that I smelt nice. That's the sweetest thing a lady had ever said to me. In my career, I've received many lovely compliments, but that went deep. For the rest of my time on the bash, we found ourselves in the breakfast queue together and were rarely apart. It felt so natural to be in each other's company. At Charleville, I lent her a pair of thick socks to keep her feet warm as we sat on a bench outside the motel rooms. I would have kissed her then, but there were too many people around who knew us, and anyway, neither of us would allow it to go any further out of respect for our respective partners. But I knew I would never forget Meg Doyle, and I was sure she felt the same way. The night before I flew back to Sydney, we went for an evening walk through the lonely, empty streets of Longreach, while the rest of the Scholastic crew had a motel room party. We were like two teenagers not really knowing how to behave. We returned to the party and comments were made that we were in love. 10 years would pass before we gave in to this truth. Meg thought I'd forgotten all about her. Meg never really left my mind after I left the Variety Bash in Longreach. It was as though I had known her for a long time. We felt so natural together. Back in Sydney, I kept seeing women who reminded me of Meg. One day she came to my office to get a signature on a piece of artwork from the picture book for Scholastic. It was pretty obvious then there was a natural connection between us that couldn't be ignored. That was a happy and sad moment for both of us. I know Phil Matthews noticed it. After that, I rang her at Scholastic a few times discreetly. After all, she was my editor. The friendship was a bit hard on Meg because it was all on my terms. She never had my phone number, as I was afraid she might ring at the wrong time. She accepted that. Understandably, Mary Kay wasn't very happy about the phone calls and eventually demanded that I stop calling Meg. I left a message on Meg's work answering machine after hours, saying that we were being silly keeping in contact and were never going to get more involved, even though the feelings were there. I had to be cruel to Meg so I could say to Mary Kay without lying that I'd stopped calling her. It was the only way to convince Mary Kay that I meant what I'd promised. Meg had no way of talking me out of it, even if she'd wanted to. There were no lingering goodbyes. I had a feeling Meg would have thrown away the socks I gave her in Charleville after that, and I was right. A few years later, Meg turned up with her partner at one of my Sydney shows, and nothing had changed. I almost felt sorry for him because he could see the electricity between us as we talked again briefly. Phil Matthews had said to me earlier backstage, "You know Meg Doyle's out there." Phil had seen before how she affected me. And that's how it was until 2005 when I was asked to sing at the Variety Children's Christmas party at Darling Harbour. I knew Meg had gone on to become more involved with Variety, so I couldn't help but ask if she was around. Sure enough, I spotted her from at least 150 metres away. I hadn't even forgotten her walk. Not really knowing what I was doing next, I boldly caught up with her and gave her that kiss I'd missed out on back in Longreach. Meg was shocked but didn't back away. As she walked with me to the table where I was signing autographs, she told me she thought I'd forgotten about her. Hardly, I told her. Well, that was the new beginning of sorts, but Meg still didn't get my phone number. I called her very infrequently in the next 12 months. One time was the day before her birthday in November. It was still only a love affair of the mind as I searched for love in Mary Kay's eyes. I didn't really want to leave Mary Kay, but I was very unhappy. Maybe she could always see me leaving her, who knows? But had she declared her love for me any time, maybe things would have been different. For years I would tell her that I loved her and her answer was always, "Yes, I know." I often went up to Springbrook on my own, as Mary Kay didn't enjoy the bush. I bought a house on the Isle of Capri at Surfers Paradise to at least get her to come to Queensland. I used to make her breakfast and go up to the farm in the hinterland most days until dinner, just like a farmer would. At the end of 2006, I started to ring Meg again, especially when I was at Springbrook. I couldn't take the unhappiness in my marriage any longer, and I finally decided to ring Mary Kay and tell her when she was at Gundawindi with her mother. There was no answer, so I sent a long letter by fax instead. In hindsight, that was a terrible way to end my marriage. A few days later, we were face to face in Epping. I cried until I was out of breath. 37 years is a long time. There was such tension inside me. It was mainly a deep sadness, as I'd always believed we would be grandparents together. Mary Kay had said nothing to indicate she didn't want me to go and didn't cry at all. She moved towards me to give me a hug, but I rejected her, thinking it's all too late for affection now. A few weeks later, Meg was going to be in Brisbane visiting a sick friend, and I invited her to my concert at the 12th Night Theatre. After the show that night, Steve Newton, my sound engineer, said to me, "You know there's a woman in a red dress climbing into your ute?" I said, "Who the hell do you think gave her the keys?" That is now regarded as our anniversary. We were married on the same day, 10th of March, 6 years later, in 2013 in Sydney. We wanted a small private wedding with our closest friends and family, and the setting of Mark and Caroline Jago's garden couldn't have been more perfect. Meg and I were married at their beautiful bush paradise home on a sandstone ridge tucked away between two national parks above the northern beaches of Sydney. I don't regret my 37 years with Mary Kay, but I guess I wanted more out of life than what was on offer. I found myself being held back. I felt myself being forced to act my age, to be old and over it. I felt like I still had a lifetime ahead of me. In fact, in the last 7 years with Meg, more interesting things have happened to me than I could have imagined. I've proved that life can really begin in your 60s. Call me selfish, but as far as I know, you get one chance only. My relationship with Phil Matthews was definitely getting tired too. Between my marriage and my long-time manager, it felt like I was being slowed down against my will. I was being persuaded that I was past it. Meg came into my life and made me realise that I had a lot left in the tank. At this stage, my career was in limbo. Phil had retired and left me with an organisation that had collapsed. I had to fire the woman he'd hired because she was a complete disaster. Marius L. stepped in as my agent. My own staff had done all my bookings for decades up to this point. Then enter David Woodward, who had been hired by EMI around that same time as a freelance publicist for my 2008 album Hillbilly Road. David was making a name for himself in Tamworth, where he was employed to work on the Country Music Festival. He seemed to appear quite often from then on, just doing whatever he could for me. I wondered whether he had another agenda in the long term, but I didn't mind if he did. David and Meg and I got on famously and we became friends. So when the time came, it was David who immediately sprang to mind as someone who might like to manage me. David, now in his mid-30s, was born to manage. Public relations are his forte. Anyone he contacts never forgets his personal charm, whether it's face-to-face or over the phone. Born and raised in Newcastle, he has an inbuilt toughness that he disguises very well, so he is ideal for almost any task an artist needs. He's become very much a part of our family. He is also incredibly generous with his time. Nothing is too much to ask of him, and his favourite expression is, "Leave it to me." David has played a big part in bringing me out of the doldrums, with Meg by my side. When Meg and I decided to live together in 2007, the media was rather determined to make it public. I had a corporate gig lined up about half an hour from Alice Springs at Urumina on Deepwell Station, owned by Billy and Jan Hayes. Billy and Jan had agreed some years earlier to let Ted Egan build a small mock-up bush village on Urumina for a movie to be made of his song Drover's Boy. Urumina was 1,000 acres that had been separated off from Deepwell and developed by Billy and Jan as a tourist venture. I was first introduced to Billy and Jan in 1999 when we returned to Undulia to do some video clips for a couple of the songs on the Way It Is album. Billy was Jim Hayes' brother from the song Three Sons. The movie didn't eventuate, but the village remained and was ideal for corporate events, weddings and functions. I had done a corporate gig there previously, as well as using it as a setting for a number of song film clips, including 1,000 Feet with Warren H. Williams. Bill and Jan worked tirelessly at making it a highly successful tourist venture. In light of the media attention, Phil thought the perfect solution was for Meg to escape to Urumina with me. Jan was so supportive, and we figured we would be well out of the reach of the media. But even there, a local journalist and a photographer turned up under the pretense of interviewing me for a story about my songwriting. Their intention, really, was to at least get a photo of Meg and me together. We were wise to them. Jan very quickly told them that their future in Alice Springs would not be bright if they didn't clear off, which they did. Such is the respect the Hayes family commands in the area. Over the years, Billy and Jan became great friends to both of us. We often stayed in one of the little cottages there, surrounded by nature's sculptures of flintstone. There is evidence of Aboriginal occupation everywhere if you know what to look for. The broken flint was ideal for making spearheads and knives. This was where I'd taken Lawsy in December 2006. It was the end of the station bed and breakfast trip we went on together. When I was there with Lawsy, I built a permanent stock camp utilising a huge square rock and a few steel posts. It is still there under a coolabah tree. Billy called it Emu's Camp. Billy was the most uncomplicated true bushy. He used to stir me about a rip wood chip, or chip wood chip as he called it. But deep down he completely understood my love of the Australian bushland. He was deeply attached to his country, as deep as the Eastern Aranda mob were. Billy had a great relationship with the traditional owners and a quiet respect for them. They still wandered over Deepwell Station. Billy didn't say much about that. Some of his white mates probably didn't understand his association with them, and I respected him for it. The last time Meg and I were out there, Jan and Billy had Urumina up for sale. They wanted to take life a little easier. Bush couples like Billy and Jan bond together, I believe, like no others. On a big station, you have to pull together through hard times and enjoy each other's company. Partnerships out there have to be strong to survive. We had a wonderful time as usual on that visit and thoroughly enjoyed Billy's sense of humour. It had become a habit for us to spend a night around the fire at Emu's Camp with Jan and Billy, sharing a steak and a few beers and wine. Billy cooked it on the campfire that night. Tragically, Billy, a legendary horseman and the inspiration behind Murray Harton's poem Turbulence, died a few days later. He was out on his quad bike mustering cattle with his son, Billy Jr. He was in his element, tearing around the scrub on a modern-day horse. Sadly, quads don't have eyes like a horse does, and Billy didn't see the deep washaway in the grass. The quad dived into the gully and threw Billy into the air. He came down and broke his neck. He died instantly. Jan's soulmate was gone. We were devastated for Jan. It still brings tears to my eyes thinking about it. Billy was absolutely true blue, and his death was a loss to this country. Meg and I returned to Alice Springs for Billy's funeral. The Alice Springs Convention Centre was filled to overflowing. Both white and Indigenous people from all over the country came to pay their respects to Billy and his great family. At the conclusion of the public service, Jan asked us to attend the burial with the family. The small procession led by Billy's horse was heart-wrenching. I offered a poem. It was based on the idea that Billy was always happiest out on the station chasing cattle. He died doing what he loved. We will always treasure both Billy and Jan's friendship. One of the best things I've learnt through Meg is to treasure friendship. Meg is the kind of person who rarely loses contact with a friend. She has so many. In my previous life, there didn't seem to be time for many friends outside family. Weekends, when mates generally get together, have always been my work time, but Meg has taught me the joy of having good mates. I now keep in touch with more of them, new and old, like never before. I guess I'm a bit like my dad. He was never one to socialise. It was always up to Mum. The invention of text messages on phones has to be the best thing for keeping in touch. I like to send a photo as well. We should never take for granted how wonderful man is at coming up with new ideas to bring the world closer together. And it's so good to be in love again. Meg is not just my wife, she is my partner in life. 3 sons. I'm into cattle, my father was too, from great-great-grandfather all the way through. We scarcely have wasted an hour of daylight sticking to Herefords, and it's been all right. Prepared for the lean times and saved for a drought, but you can't always plan how the future turns out. Life's getting harder to make what we need with low cattle prices and more mouths to feed. 6 generations where camels run free. I hope I am never too blind to see how fortunate, how proud can an old fella be. 3 sons in their swags round the stock camp with me. Sent the boys off to school to see Adelaide, how other folks live, get a job, learn a trade. Couldn't keep them away 'cause their hearts are still here. My butcher, my welder, my diesel engineer. And I come in for dinner, the sun hits the range. In a matter of seconds, the colours all change. From gold down to violet, the soul has been burned, and I understand fully why they have returned. 'Cause I'm into cattle, my father was too, from great-great-grandfather all the way through, and we've never been guilty of wasting daylight. We work hard, we play hard, and we sleep well at night.